Welcome to History Teller YT, the place where the past comes alive. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the most defining chapters in human history, the American Revolution. From the tea-stained waters of Boston Harbor to the blood-soaked fields of Saratoga, from George Washington's desperate winter at Valley Forge to the triumphant surrender at Yorktown. This is the story of how 13 colonies dared to defy the mightiest empire on earth and won. But this is more than just a tale of battles and generals. It is the story of ordinary farmers and artisans who rose to fight for liberty. It is the story of ideas, freedom, equality, self-government that reshaped not only America, but the entire world. We'll follow the revolution's legacy beyond 1776, through the birth of the Constitution, the trials of the young republic, the struggle over slavery in native lands, and the turbulent path toward a more perfect union. By the end of this journey, you will see how the revolution was not just a single event, but the beginning of an ongoing experiment, one that continues to shape our lives today. So sit back, subscribe, and prepare to relive the epic struggle, sacrifice, and triumph of the American Revolution. In the mid-18th century, the American colonies were thriving outposts of the British Empire, stretching from the rocky coasts of New England to the fertile lands of the southern plantations. By 1760, nearly 2 million colonists lived in North America, tied together by language, law, and loyalty to the crown. Yet beneath this surface of unity, a sense of distance and difference had already begun to grow. The Atlantic Ocean separated colonists from London by thousands of miles, and that separation created a distinctive way of life. Colonists governed themselves through local assemblies, debated issues openly in town meetings, and felt an increasing sense that their identity was not simply British, but something new, something distinctly American. Still, the colonies benefited from British protection against French and native rivals, and the crown expected obedience in return. The balance held until the end of the French and Indian War, when Britain, burdened with staggering war debt, turned to the colonies for revenue. That decision would unleash a storm neither side could control. The seeds of rebellion, though not yet fully sprouted, were already sown in the soil of distance, self-governance, and an emerging identity. The 1760s brought dramatic changes to colonial life. Britain, eager to stabilize its finances after defeating France, introduced a series of taxes and trade regulations. The Sugar Act of 1764 placed duties on molasses and sugar, while the infamous Stamp Act of 1765 demanded payment on every legal document, newspaper, and even playing cards. To London, these taxes seemed modest and fair. To colonists, they struck at the heart of liberty. Colonists argued that only their elected assemblies, not a distant parliament, had the right to levy taxes. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry, uniting farmers, merchants, lawyers, and artisans in shared outrage. Protests erupted across the colonies, sometimes turning violent, as effigies of tax collectors burned in the streets. The Sons of Liberty emerged as a radical voice, organizing boycotts that struck at British trade. What Britain considered legitimate governance, Americans experienced as tyranny. Each new act, the Townshend Duties, the Quartering Act, the Tea Act, tightened the knot of resentment. By the early 1770s, the once loyal colonies had been transformed into a restless society, brimming with anger, defiance, and a new sense of collective destiny. No city embodied colonial resistance more than Boston. Crowded, energetic, and fiercely independent, Boston became the center of revolutionary agitation. When British troops arrived in 1768 to enforce customs regulations, tension exploded. The Boston Massacre of 1770 turned the city into a symbol of British oppression as 5 colonists fell to soldiers' muskets. Though the soldiers were later acquitted, Paul Revere's engraving and fiery speeches by patriots like Samuel Adams turned the event into propaganda that ignited outrage across the colonies. 3 years later, another act of defiance shook the empire, the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, a band of patriots boarded British ships in December 1773 and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It was not simply about tea, it was about principle. To pay the tax was to accept Parliament's right to rule without consent. Britain's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed, its self-government curtailed, and its people placed under military authority. Far from crushing rebellion, these acts united the colonies in outrage. The spark had been struck in Boston, but the fire of revolution was spreading across America. By 1774, the colonies had reached a breaking point. Britain's coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, were designed to punish Massachusetts and bring rebellious Boston to heel. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Colonists across North America realized that if Parliament could crush Boston's liberties, no colony was safe. Out of this crisis came the decision to hold a Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial delegates to coordinate a united response. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, met in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. It was an extraordinary moment. Farmers, lawyers, planters, merchants, and ministers who had once thought of themselves only as Virginians, New Yorkers, or South Carolinians now sat side by side as Americans. Some delegates, like John Adams and Patrick Henry, urged bold action. Others, such as Joseph Galloway, hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Yet even the most cautious voices agreed that something had to be done. The Congress issued a declaration of rights and grievances, insisting that Parliament had no authority to tax the colonies without consent. They also organized a boycott of British goods, cutting into the empire's trade profits. Though the Congress stopped short of declaring independence, its very existence marked a revolutionary shift. The colonies were acting together as a single political body. The seeds planted in Philadelphia in 1774 would, within 2 years, grow into a full demand for independence. While delegates debated in Philadelphia, events in Massachusetts raced ahead. British General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, learned that colonial militias, called Minutemen for their readiness, were stockpiling arms in Concord, just outside Boston. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Gage dispatched 700 soldiers to seize the weapons and arrest Patriot leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams. But Boston's network of writers, including Paul Revere and William Dawes, spread the alarm across the countryside. The regulars are coming. At dawn on April 19th, British troops confronted a small band of militia on Lexington Green. No one knows who fired the first shot, but once muskets blazed, 8 colonists lay dead and the revolution had begun. The British marched on to Concord, where they destroyed supplies, but soon found themselves under fire from hundreds of armed farmers. Forced into retreat, the Redcoats were harassed all the way back to Boston by waves of militia, suffering heavy casualties. News of Lexington and Concord electrified the colonies. Ordinary men, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, had stood against the most powerful army in the world and lived to tell the tale. This shot heard round the world was more than a spark of rebellion. It was the opening act of a war for independence. Suddenly, the abstract debates about rights and representation had become a matter of blood and sacrifice. As musket smoke lingered over Massachusetts, the colonies faced a new reality. They were at war. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, this time with Georgia in attendance. Delegates faced momentous questions. Should they seek reconciliation with Britain or prepare for a full-scale conflict? Even as moderates pushed for the olive branch petition, a final plea for peace, events moved quickly. Armed clashes spread, and colonial militias besieged Boston. Congress realized they needed a unified army and a commander who could command respect across the colonies. Their choice was George Washington of Virginia. Washington was tall, imposing, and carried with him a reputation for discipline and honor earned during the French and Indian War. Importantly, as a Southerner, he balanced the strong New England presence in the rebellion, binding the regions together. In June 1775, Washington was unanimously appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He accepted with humility, declaring he sought no salary beyond expenses. His leadership gave the Revolution both military direction and moral authority. Around the same time, colonial forces fought the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill, proving that untrained Americans could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. Though technically a British victory, the heavy losses convinced many that this would be no short war. As Washington rode north to take command outside Boston, the Revolution had moved beyond protest in a full-fledged war, a struggle that would demand everything from those who called themselves Americans. In the summer of 1775, as muskets roared outside Boston and George Washington assumed command of the newly formed Continental Army, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress found themselves walking a perilous tightrope. Many colonists still clung to the hope of reconciliation with Britain, believing that their quarrel was not with King George III himself, but with corrupt ministers in Parliament. To express this loyalty, Congress drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final plea for peace. Written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, the petition declared the colony's devotion to the Crown while requesting the King's intervention to redress their grievances. It was a carefully worded gesture of loyalty, a last chance to avoid full-scale war. Yet while quills scratched in Philadelphia, muskets cracked at the Battle of Bunker Hill, where British troops suffered devastating losses in a costly victory. The gap between words of loyalty and acts of defiance grew wider. When the Olive Branch Petition reached London, King George III dismissed it outright. Instead of extending an olive branch, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion in August 1775, declaring the colonies to be in open revolt and calling upon his subjects to suppress the insurrection. For many colonists, this rejection marked a turning point. No longer could they cling to the illusion of royal protection. The king himself had branded them traitors. The path toward reconciliation had ended, leaving only the hard and dangerous road to independence. What had begun as a fight over rights within the empire was rapidly becoming a struggle for separation from it. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia that would electrify the colonies and reshape the debate over independence. Written by the English-born radical Thomas Paine, Common Sense was short, fiery, and direct, qualities that made it accessible to ordinary farmers and artisans, as well as intellectuals. Paine's argument was revolutionary not only in its conclusions, but in its clarity. He wrote that monarchy was an absurd institution, unfit for a free people, and that America owed no loyalty to a distant king who ruled by heredity rather than merit. "'Tis time to part," Paine declared, transforming abstract grievances into a moral imperative. Within months, Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies, spreading like wildfire across taverns, churches, and marketplaces. Its language resonated with ordinary colonists who had long felt the sting of British taxes, soldiers quartered in their towns, and the dismissal of their rights. Paine's words reframed the conflict. This was no longer a fight for fair treatment within the empire, but a fight for freedom from it. By appealing to both reason and passion, he made independence not just thinkable, but necessary. Leaders like George Washington, John Adams, and even reluctant moderates recognized the pamphlet's power. The ideological foundation of independence had been laid, not by lofty academic treatises, but by a plain-spoken pamphlet that gave voice to the common people. From this moment, the idea of independence was no longer a radical whisper. It was a swelling chorus demanding action. By the spring of 1776, the tide of opinion within the colonies had shifted decisively toward independence. Skirmishes with British troops continued, and the king's refusal to compromise left little room for reconciliation. Colonies one by one instructed their delegates to support separation, and in June, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. This committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, and the young Virginian Thomas Jefferson. Though Adams and Franklin were seasoned statesmen, it was Jefferson who was chosen to draft the document, admired for his eloquence and clarity of thought. Working in a rented room in Philadelphia, Jefferson poured his ideas on a parchment, crafting a text that would proclaim the colonies not merely as rebels, but as a new nation. Drawing on Enlightenment principles, especially the writings of John Locke, Jefferson asserted that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments, he argued, exist only by the consent of the governed, and when a government becomes destructive of these rights, the people have the authority to alter or abolish it. Adams and Franklin suggested edits, but the essential power of Jefferson's words remained intact. On July 2nd, Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. As church bells rang and crowds cheered, the colonies declared themselves free and independent states. It was both a bold assertion of universal principles and a dangerous act of treason against the crown. In that moment, 13 colonies transformed into the United States of America, staking their future on the belief that liberty was worth any sacrifice. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted in July 1776, its words thundered across the Atlantic world. To Americans, it was a proclamation of liberty and a unifying call to arms. Town criers read it aloud in public squares. Ministers preached its words from pulpits, and militiamen carried it into battle as a banner of purpose. For enslaved African Americans, women, and native peoples, its promises were not yet realized, but the ideals nonetheless resonated in powerful ways. Abroad, the Declaration announced to Europe that America was no longer a rebellious colony, but an aspiring nation, seeking recognition and allies. But if Americans felt hope, Britain felt outrage. King George III and his ministers regarded the Declaration as the ultimate act of treason. Determined to crush the rebellion, Britain marshaled its unmatched resources: warships, professional soldiers, and foreign mercenaries. In August 1776, Britain launched the largest military expedition it had ever sent abroad. Over 30,000 troops, including thousands of German Hessians, sailed into New York Harbor under the command of General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe. Their mission was clear: capture New York, sever New England from the rest of the colonies, and end the rebellion quickly. Facing them was George Washington and his fledgling Continental Army, brave but poorly trained, poorly equipped, and vastly outnumbered. The war, once a series of scattered skirmishes, was now a global conflict between empire and insurgency. The revolution had entered its most perilous phase, and the survival of the new nation hung by a thread. The British assault on New York in the summer of 1776 was a test of George Washington's leadership and the resilience of the Continental Army. Washington, newly in command, understood the symbolic and strategic importance of New York. Situated at the mouth of the Hudson River, it was vital for controlling trade and communication between the northern and southern colonies. Yet defending it was nearly impossible. The British Navy, with its towering masts and thunderous cannons, dominated the harbor. When the battle began on Long Island in late August, the Americans were overwhelmed. British forces outflanked Washington's troops, inflicting heavy losses. Under cover of night and with remarkable discipline, Washington executed a daring retreat across the East River, saving his army from annihilation. In the weeks that followed, the Continental Army suffered a series of defeats: Harlem Heights, White Plains, Fort Washington. New York City fell to the British and became their military headquarters for the rest of the war. For many patriots, it seemed the cause of independence was collapsing. Soldiers deserted, morale plummeted, and doubts spread even within Congress. Yet Washington's skillful retreats kept the army alive. He recognized that the revolution would not be won by holding cities, but by preserving the army itself. As long as the Continental Army endured, the revolution endured. The loss of New York was a devastating blow, but it was not the end. Washington's resolve, combined with the determination of his ragged soldiers, ensured that the dream of liberty still flickered in the darkness. By December 1776, the revolution stood on the brink of collapse. Washington's army had been driven across New Jersey, retreating before superior British forces. Soldiers marched barefoot through snow, leaving bloody footprints on frozen ground. Enlistments were expiring at year's end, and unless something dramatic happened, the army might dissolve altogether. In this desperate hour, Washington conceived a bold gamble. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his men across the ice-choked Delaware River to strike a surprise blow at the Hessian garrison in Trenton. Wrapped in rags, chilled to the bone, the soldiers rode silently through the freezing waters. By dawn, they reached the Jersey shore, their muskets damp, but their spirit burning. The attack was swift and overwhelming. The Hessians, caught off guard after a night of celebration, surrendered in droves. The victory at Trenton electrified the nation. Just days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force and forcing the enemy to retreat toward New Brunswick. These victories did more than reclaim ground. They revived morale, inspired enlistments, and demonstrated that the Continental Army could outmaneuver the mightiest military on earth. Washington's leadership during these dark months transformed him into a symbol of perseverance and resilience. "These are the times that try men's souls," wrote Thomas Paine in The American Crisis, echoing the desperation and determination of the moment. Against all odds, the revolution had survived its first great trial. The war would continue, and the dream of independence still lived. By 1777, the British believed they had devised a strategy that would finally end the rebellion. Their plans centered on isolating New England, the heart of revolutionary fervor, from the rest of the colonies. If they could seize control of the Hudson River and cut off Massachusetts and its neighbors, they hoped the rebellion would wither away. General John Burgoyne, a confident and ambitious officer, was tasked with leading an army south from Canada through the dense forests of upstate New York. His force of British regulars German auxiliaries, Loyalist volunteers, and Native American allies was formidable. Meanwhile, British forces under General William Howe were expected to move north from New York City and link up with Burgoyne at Albany. On paper, the plan was elegant. In reality, it was fatally flawed. Communication across vast distances was slow, coordination difficult, and American resistance fiercer than expected. Burgoyne's advance soon became a nightmare. His army dragged heavy baggage trains through wilderness, slowed by rough terrain and constant skirmishes. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and the anticipated support from Howe never materialized, because Howe had marched his army south to capture Philadelphia instead. Burgoyne, isolated and surrounded, was forced to rely on his own dwindling resources. What had begun as a confident march turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of the entire war, not only in America, but across the Atlantic world. The clash came in the autumn of 1777 near Saratoga, New York. American forces under General Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold confronted Burgoyne's weary army. The first engagement at Freeman's Farm in September was bloody and inconclusive, but it demonstrated the growing skill of American troops. A second battle at Bemis Heights in October proved decisive. Arnold, though technically relieved of command after disputes with Gates, charged into the fray and inspired the Americans to press their attack. Burgoyne's lines collapsed under relentless assaults, and his retreat was cut off. With no reinforcements, no supplies, and no escape, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men on October 17, 1777. The victory at Saratoga was more than just a battlefield triumph. It was a psychological and diplomatic breakthrough. For the first time, an American army had captured a full British force, proving that the revolution was not a lost cause, but a viable struggle. Patriots celebrated across the colonies, morale soared, and the world took notice. The victory shattered Britain's aura of invincibility and gave foreign nations reason to believe that the American experiment might succeed. It was, as one observer declared, the turning point of the revolution. Yet the true impact of Saratoga would extend far beyond the borders of New York. It would reach across the Atlantic to the courts of Europe. The American Revolution had always been more than a domestic dispute. It was part of the broader rivalry between empires. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw in America an opportunity to weaken its old enemy Britain. For months, American diplomats like Benjamin Franklin had lobbied in Paris, seeking recognition and aid. But the French court, cautious and calculating, hesitated to commit until the Americans proved they could win. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. Suddenly, France recognized that the revolution was not a feudal rebellion, but a legitimate war with a chance of success. In February 1778, France formally signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States. It was a moment of enormous significance. French money, weapons, and eventually soldiers and ships would transform the conflict from a colonial uprising into a global war. Britain now faced not just rebellious colonists, but one of the most powerful navies in the world. The revolution spread onto the oceans, the Caribbean, and even European waters. For the Americans, French support provided desperately needed supplies and credibility. For Washington's army, it meant survival and renewed hope. Yet reliance on France also introduced complexities, questions of trust, differing strategies, and competing goals. Still, without French recognition and support, the revolution may well have collapsed. Saratoga had turned the tide, and the entry of France marked the moment when the struggle for independence truly became an international war. The fate of America was now bound to the balance of global power. After the stunning American victory at Saratoga in 1777, spirits were high, but the war was far from won. The British, under General William Howe, shifted their attention to Philadelphia, the rebel capital. Marching through Pennsylvania, Howe's forces clashed with Washington's army at Brandywine Creek in September. The British outmaneuvered the Americans, forcing them into retreat and capturing Philadelphia soon after. The loss of the capital was a heavy blow, both symbolically and strategically. Washington attempted to strike back at Germantown in October, but the battle ended in confusion and defeat. Though the Americans fought bravely, the British now occupied the heart of the rebellion. Congress fled into exile, and whispers spread that perhaps Washington was not the leader America needed. Critics, including some in Congress and even rival generals, questioned his competence. Yet Washington remained resolute. He knew that survival, not glorious victory, was the true measure of success at this stage of the war. In December 1777, he led his battered army into winter quarters at a remote location northwest of Philadelphia, Valley Forge. There, amidst snow-covered hills and bare forests, the Continental Army would endure one of the darkest chapters of the Revolution. Disease, hunger, and despair stalked the camp, threatening to undo the cause of independence not by defeat in battle, but by slow attrition. The march to Valley Forge was not just a physical journey, but a symbolic passage into the crucible that would test whether the revolution itself could endure the harshest trials. Valley Forge became synonymous with suffering, but also with resilience. Nearly 12,000 soldiers marched into the encampment that winter, many lacking proper clothing or shoes. Accounts describe men wrapping rags around their feet, leaving bloody prints in the snow. Food supplies were scarce. Some subsisted on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked into hard lumps. Disease ravaged the camp. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery claimed thousands of lives. The bitter cold worsened every misery, and morale sank dangerously low. Desertions increased, and some officers feared the army might dissolve before spring. Yet in this crucible of suffering, the Continental Army discovered its true strength. Washington's leadership was critical. He moved among the huts, sharing the hardships of his men, lending words of encouragement, and maintaining discipline without cruelty. His presence reminded the soldiers that they were fighting not for pay or comfort, but for the cause of liberty. Women, too, played vital roles at Valley Forge. Wives in camp followers cooked, mended clothes, and nursed the sick, sustaining the men in unseen but essential ways. The suffering at Valley Forge revealed the revolution's brutal realities. Independence was not an abstract idea, but a cause purchased through blood, hunger, and unyielding sacrifice. Those who endured that winter became bound by an unbreakable sense of comradeship and purpose. They would emerge not broken, but stronger, forged by fire into a more determined force. Valley Forge, though remembered for its misery, was also the place where the Continental Army truly became a professional army capable of standing against the world's mightiest empire. Amidst the bleakness of Valley Forge came a figure who would transform the ragged Continental Army into a disciplined fighting force. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who had served in the armies of Europe. Arriving in America in 1778, von Steuben brought with him not only experience, but also a gift for training and organization. With Washington's support, he undertook the monumental task of drilling the army. Day after day, he instructed soldiers in the essentials of modern warfare, marching in formation, loading and firing with speed and precision, using bayonets effectively, and maintaining camp hygiene to prevent disease. His methods were practical, his language often colorful. He cursed in German, French, and broken English, sometimes relying on aides to translate his explosive commands. But the soldiers responded with enthusiasm. Von Steuben also introduced a training manual that became the backbone of the Continental Army's discipline. The transformation was astonishing. Men who had once scattered in confusion at Germantown now moved with coordinated precision, instilled with pride and confidence. By the time spring arrived, the Continental Army was no longer a collection of militia and half-trained recruits. It was a unified, professional force capable of standing toe-to-toe with Britain's best. The winter at Valley Forge had nearly destroyed the revolution, but instead, it became a turning point. Hardship had tested the soldiers, and von Steuben's training had honed them. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it carried not only muskets and bayonets, but also a newfound discipline and belief in ultimate victory. The revolution had survived its darkest winter, and America's fight for independence burned brighter than ever. When France formally entered the war in 1778, the conflict transformed overnight from a colonial rebellion into a global struggle. For the Americans, the French alliance meant not only supplies and money, but also naval and military support on a scale they had never imagined. In the spring of 1778, the French fleet, under Admiral Charles Hector d'Estaing, crossed the Atlantic to join the fight. Although initial joint operations, such as the siege of Newport, Rhode Island, failed due to miscommunication and storms, the very presence of the French Navy altered the balance of power. Britain, once dominant at sea, now had to divide its fleet between Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. For Washington and his army, French support provided legitimacy and hope. French officers, like the young Marquis de Lafayette, became symbols of the alliance. Lafayette, barely in his 20s, had already proven himself on the battlefield and earned Washington's affection as a surrogate son. His bravery, idealism, and connections to the French court made him an invaluable link between the two nations. Yet the alliance also brought challenges. Americans feared being overshadowed by French interests, while the French sometimes questioned the discipline and effectiveness of their allies. Still, both sides recognized that their fates were bound together. France wanted revenge against Britain, and America wanted independence. In this shared cause, a fragile but powerful partnership was forged. The revolution was no longer America's fight alone. It was part of a much larger contest for supremacy across oceans and continents. By 1778, the British realized that their strategy of focusing on the northern colonies had failed. Saratoga had proven that the rebellion could not be easily crushed there, and the entry of France meant they faced new threats everywhere. Britain shifted its attention southward, hoping to exploit divisions and rally loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. The southern colonies, with their large enslaved populations and plantation economies, were seen as more vulnerable to British influence. In late 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia, establishing a foothold in the South. By 1780, they seized Charleston, South Carolina, in one of the worst American defeats of the war, capturing thousands of soldiers. British commanders like Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis believed they could gradually pacify the region by combining military force with loyalist militias. At first, this strategy seemed to work, but soon the realities of guerrilla warfare unraveled their plans. Patriot militias, led by figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, launched surprise attacks from swamps and forests, harassing supply lines and ambushing detachments. Instead of rallying loyalist support, British brutality often drove neutral colonists into the Patriot camp. Meanwhile, Washington dispatched Nathanael Greene to lead the Southern campaign. Greene, a master of strategy, understood that he could not defeat Cornwallis in pitched battles, but he could wear him down through a war of movement. His approach was summed up in his own words: "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." The war in the South became a grinding contest of endurance, and it was here that the Revolution's final chapter would be written. The American Revolution may have begun in Massachusetts town greens and Pennsylvania meeting halls, but by 1779, it was a conflict spanning the globe. France's entry into the war had forced Britain to defend far-flung colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Spain, though not officially allied with the United States, joined France against Britain in 1779, further straining British resources. Spanish forces laid siege to Gibraltar, contested the British in Florida, and sent fleets to the Caribbean. The Dutch, too, were eventually drawn into the struggle as Britain sought to choke off American trade. This global war meant that every ship, every soldier, and every pound Britain committed to America came at the expense of defending its vast empire. Meanwhile, American privateers prowled the seas, capturing hundreds of British merchant ships and weakening morale on the home front. The Revolution also inspired debates across Europe about liberty, monarchy, and the rights of people. The Enlightenment ideals woven into the Declaration of Independence resonated with philosophers and reformers who saw in America a living experiment. For Britain, what had begun as an effort to discipline wayward colonies had spiraled into a contest with multiple great powers. For America, survival depended on maintaining this international support. The Revolution was no longer confined to 13 colonies. It had become part of a global reshaping of power. In this larger struggle, the fate of America was just one piece of a wider contest that would determine the future balance of empires. In 1780, Britain turned its focus fully on the southern colonies, believing this region could be the key to ending the war. Their reasoning was simple. The South contained vast wealth from plantations, a large enslaved population that might be turned against their masters, and a significant number of loyalists who could, in theory, rally to the Crown's side. With this in mind, General Sir Henry Clinton launched a massive campaign against Charleston, South Carolina, the most important port in the South. The siege of Charleston began in March 1780. The British surrounded the city by land and sea, cutting off supplies and bombarding its defenses. After weeks of resistance, the city was starved into surrender. On May 12th, Charleston fell, and more than 5,000 American soldiers were captured, one of the worst defeats of the entire war. The loss sent shockwaves through the colonies. Many fear that the Revolution might collapse altogether in the South. British forces now controlled Georgia and much of South Carolina, and loyalist militias seemed poised to enforce royal authority. Yet the fall of Charleston, instead of crushing the spirit of resistance, ultimately sparked a fiercer wave of rebellion. Patriots scattered into the countryside, organizing irregular bands that launched hit-and-run attacks on British patrols. The Revolution in the South became less a war of armies and more a struggle of neighbors, families, and communities divided by loyalty. It was brutal, personal, and often merciless. Far from pacifying the South, Britain's victory at Charleston lit the fires of partisan warfare that would grind down its forces in the years ahead. The collapse of formal American defenses in the South gave rise to a new kind of warfare: guerrilla tactics waged by small, mobile bands of fighters who knew the swamps, forests, and back roads better than their enemies. Among these leaders, none became more legendary than Francis Marion, nicknamed the Swamp Fox. Marion and his men struck swiftly at British supply lines, ambushed detachments, and then vanished into the dense Carolina swamps, leaving their enemies frustrated and demoralized. His exploits inspired patriots and terrified loyalists, proving that resistance could survive even after major defeats. Other leaders, such as Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens, also carried out relentless partisan campaigns, making the South a nightmare of endless skirmishes and reprisals. Meanwhile, the Continental Army sought to rebuild after the disaster at Charleston. Congress appointed General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to command in the South. But Gates's reputation crumbled after his disastrous defeat at Camden in August 1780, where poorly trained militia broke under British fire, leaving the army shattered. Yet out of this despair rose new leaders who would shape the course of the war. Nathaniel Greene, a trusted officer of Washington, was given command of the Southern Department. Greene's genius lay not in winning grand battles, but in his ability to keep the army alive and wear down the enemy through maneuver and persistence. His arrival in the South marked a turning point. The Revolution, once staggering under British dominance, now found new leadership, new tactics, and new energy that would slowly shift the momentum back toward independence. When Nathaniel Greene took command in late 1780, he faced daunting odds. His army was small, ill-equipped, and demoralized. Yet Greene understood that the war in the South would not be decided by one great battle, but by a campaign of endurance. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again, he famously declared, and this philosophy guided his actions. Greene divided his forces, sending detachments under leaders like Daniel Morgan to harass the British while he maneuvered strategically. At the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, Morgan delivered a stunning victory, destroying a British force under the feared cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton. The win electrified Patriot morale and demonstrated that the Americans could beat the British even in open battle. Cornwallis, frustrated and determined, pursued Greene across the Carolinas in a grueling chase that became known as the Race to the Dan. Greene skillfully avoided destruction, drawing the British deeper into hostile territory. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Greene engaged Cornwallis in a bloody battle. Though technically a British victory, Cornwallis's army suffered crippling losses, forcing him to retreat to the coast. Greene's strategy of attrition had worked. By preserving his army and exhausting the enemy, he shifted the balance in the South. Meanwhile, Patriot militias continued to sap British control through relentless skirmishes. The combined effect of Greene's campaign and partisan warfare left Cornwallis weakened and vulnerable. Seeking a secure base of operations, Cornwallis marched his army to Virginia and fortified Yorktown. He could not have known it, but this move would lead him directly into the trap that would decide the fate of the Revolution. After months of exhausting marches and bloody encounters across the Carolinas, General Charles Cornwallis believed the South could no longer provide the decisive victory Britain needed. His army, battered and depleted by Nathaniel Greene's relentless campaign, sought rest and reinforcement. By mid-1781, Cornwallis shifted his focus northward into Virginia, hoping to sever the state's supply lines and cripple the rebellion's resources. Virginia was not only the largest colony, but also home to key leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry. Capturing it would strike a symbolic and strategic blow. Cornwallis moved his army of roughly 7,000 men into Yorktown, a small port town on the Chesapeake Bay. There, he fortified his position, constructing earthworks and redoubts along the riverfront. His decision was bold but risky. Yorktown was defensible on land, but vulnerable from the sea, and with France now in the war, naval supremacy was no longer guaranteed. Meanwhile, American forces under the Marquis de Lafayette shadowed Cornwallis's movements, delaying his advances and cutting off reinforcements. In the north, George Washington, still encamped around New York, initially planned to attack the British stronghold there. But intelligence reports, combined with the arrival of the French army under General Rochambeau, convinced him otherwise. When word came that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake, Washington seized the moment. Instead of striking New York, he embarked on a bold gamble. March south, trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, and deliver a crushing blow that could end the war. The pieces of a decisive showdown were falling into place. The decision to strike Yorktown required extraordinary coordination between American and French forces. In August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau led a combined Franco-American army of nearly 9,000 men on a secret march from New York to Virginia. Moving with remarkable speed and discipline, they crossed rivers, traversed mountains, and covered more than 400 miles in just a few weeks. Along the way, Washington kept his true destination hidden, spreading rumors that New York remained the target. Only when they neared Virginia did the grand strategy become clear. Cornwallis was the prey, and Yorktown the trap. At sea, Admiral de Grasse's fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay in September, defeating the British Navy at the Battle of the Capes. This naval victory was crucial. It ensured that Cornwallis could not escape or be resupplied by sea. For the first time in the war, the British Navy, the pride of the empire, had been denied control of the waters. By late September, the Franco-American army surrounded Yorktown. Lafayette's troops blocked Cornwallis from the north, while Washington and Rochambeau advanced from the west. The French fleet sealed off the bay. Cornwallis, realizing too late the danger he was in, braced for siege. On September 28, 1781, the Allied forces began encircling the town, digging trenches and preparing artillery. For Washington, who had endured years of setbacks, retreats, and near collapse, this moment was the culmination of patience, perseverance, and unshakable faith. The revolution's fate would now be decided not by grand declarations or distant diplomacy, but by cannon fire and the grit of soldiers in the mud at Yorktown. The siege of Yorktown was relentless. Allied artillery batteries pounded British defenses day and night, shattering walls, collapsing fortifications, and demoralizing soldiers. Cornwallis's men endured constant bombardment, their trenches reduced to rubble, supplies dwindling, and hope fading with every passing day. On October 14th, Washington ordered a daring assault to capture two key British redoubts, Number 9 and Number 10, which anchored Cornwallis's defensive line. French forces stormed Redoubt 9 with ferocity, while American troops, led by Alexander Hamilton in one of his most famous moments, seized Redoubt 10 in a furious nighttime attack. With these positions captured, the Allies tightened the noose. Cornwallis attempted a desperate breakout across the York River, but storms scattered his boats and doomed the effort. Realizing further resistance was futile, Cornwallis requested terms of surrender. On October 19, 1781, he formally surrendered his army of more than 7,000 troops to Washington and Rochambeau. The scene was one of immense drama and symbolism. British troops marched out with lowered flags and played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Washington, maintaining strict dignity, refused to accept Cornwallis's sword personally, sending his second-in-command instead. The victory at Yorktown stunned Britain and electrified America. Though the war was not technically over, fighting continued in scattered areas. The decisive blow had been struck. For the colonists, Yorktown was not just a military triumph, but the fulfillment of years of sacrifice, endurance, and belief in an impossible dream. The revolution, once dismissed as hopeless, had delivered its climactic victory, and the birth of a nation was now within reach. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 reverberated across the Atlantic like a thunderclap. News reached London weeks later, and when Parliament learned that Cornwallis's entire army had been lost, shock turned to despair. The British public, already weary of a costly and unpopular war, erupted in anger. Many questioned why so many lives and resources had been poured into what now seemed a futile effort to hold rebellious colonies. Prime Minister Lord North, upon hearing of the defeat, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." Yet despite the psychological blow, the war did not immediately end. Britain still held strong positions in New York, Charleston, and Savannah, and King George III remained unwilling to concede independence. He even considered continuing the war with greater intensity, hoping to tire out the colonies and their allies. Meanwhile, fighting persisted on the frontiers in the Caribbean and at sea, where Britain struggled against France and Spain. In America, Washington maintained the Continental Army in position around New York, wary that Britain might attempt another offensive. For ordinary Americans, Yorktown brought celebration, but also uncertainty. Farmers still bore the burden of supplying armies, soldiers still endured hardship, and loyalists remained in peril as tempers flared. Independence had not yet been secured by treaty, and many feared Britain could regroup. The revolution stood at a crossroads. One path led to final victory, the other to prolonged conflict. It was clear that the battlefield alone would not resolve the struggle. Diplomacy would now play the decisive role. As the guns fell silent after Yorktown, attention shifted to Europe, where diplomats maneuvered to secure the terms of peace. Representing the United States were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and later Henry Lawrence, each a skilled negotiator with strong convictions. Their task was monumental: to persuade Britain to recognize American independence and to secure favorable boundaries and trade rights. But the Americans also had to balance their alliance with France, which had its own interests in weakening Britain and gaining territory. Spain, too, was at the negotiating table, seeking to reclaim Gibraltar and secure influence in the Americas. These overlapping ambitions created a complex diplomatic chessboard. The American commissioners, though grateful for French support, realized that France's goals did not always align with theirs. France hoped to keep America weak and dependent, while the Americans sought full sovereignty and expansive Western lands. John Jay, skeptical of French intentions, pressed for direct negotiations with Britain. Surprisingly, the British, eager to drive a wedge between the Allies, proved receptive. In preliminary talks, Britain indicated willingness to recognize independence and grant generous borders stretching to the Mississippi River. By late 1782, negotiations in Paris accelerated. Franklin, Adams, and Jay skillfully balanced caution with boldness, extracting concessions while avoiding betrayals of their allies. The process was fraught with tension, but for the first time, the dream of a recognized, sovereign United States seemed within reach. The fate of the Revolution, born in Boston streets and fought on countless battlefields, now rested in the drawing rooms of European palaces. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the American Revolutionary War. The terms represented a stunning diplomatic triumph for the United States. Britain recognized the independence of the 13 states, acknowledging them not as rebellious colonies, but as a free and sovereign nation. The boundaries of the new United States were established, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. Americans gained fishing rights off Newfoundland, vital for New England's economy, and secured navigation of the Mississippi. In return, Congress pledged to recommend the restitution of property to Loyalists and to honor debts owed to British creditors, though in practice these provisions were unevenly enforced. For France and Spain, the results were mixed. France gained little territory but achieved its goal of weakening Britain, while Spain regained Florida but failed to take Gibraltar. For Britain, the treaty was a bitter pill, marking the loss of its most populous and dynamic colonies. For America, it was the moment of triumph. The Revolution, begun with protests over taxes and tea, had culminated in independence recognized by the world's great powers. When the news reached America, celebrations erupted. Bells rang, cannons roared, and people gathered in towns and villages to mark the birth of their nation. Yet beneath the joy lay immense challenges: war debt, political divisions, and the task of creating a government worthy of the ideals proclaimed in 1776. Still, the Treaty of Paris was a milestone in human history, the moment when a collection of colonies became, at last, the United States of America, free to chart its own destiny. With the ink barely dry on the Treaty of Paris, Americans celebrated their independence with fireworks, parades, and prayers of thanksgiving. Yet beneath the jubilation lay daunting realities. The Revolution had secured liberty, but it had not solved the question of governance. How would 13 separate states, each jealous of its own authority, come together to form a functioning nation? During the war, the Continental Congress had operated under the Articles of Confederation, a framework drafted in 1777 but not fully ratified until 1781. The Articles reflected the colonists' deep suspicion of centralized power. Congress had authority to declare war, conduct diplomacy, and manage Western lands, but lacked the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, or enforce its resolutions. The result was a government that was more symbolic than effective. Each state retained sovereignty, often pursuing its own interests at the expense of national unity. Financially, the new nation was crippled. The war had left enormous debts. Soldiers clamored for back pay, and paper currency had depreciated into near worthlessness. Trade, once tied to Britain's empire, was disrupted, leaving American merchants scrambling for new markets. Social tensions also simmered. Loyalists faced persecution or exile. Enslaved African Americans who had fought for both sides found promises of freedom often broken, and Native American tribes, many of whom had sided with the British, now faced renewed pressures as settlers pushed westward. The Revolution had created independence, but independence brought a new, complex struggle: how to transform victory into stable governance without betraying the ideals of liberty and equality proclaimed in 1776. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation became painfully evident in the years immediately following the Revolution. Congress could not impose taxes, so it depended on voluntary contributions from the states, which rarely arrived on time or in full. Without revenue, the government could not pay soldiers, settle debts, or build infrastructure. The inability to regulate interstate commerce created economic chaos. States imposed tariffs on each other's goods, issued competing currencies, and pursued conflicting trade policies. Diplomatically, the United States struggled to command respect. Britain refused to evacuate forts in the Northwest Territory. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation, and European powers doubted whether this fragile confederation could survive. Domestically, unrest grew among ordinary citizens who felt the promises of the Revolution slipping away. In Massachusetts, economic hardship Heavy taxes and debt collection sparked Shays' Rebellion in 1786–87, when farmers took up arms to shut down courts and resist foreclosures. The rebellion terrified elites across the states, who feared that anarchy might replace liberty. At the same time, the western frontier became a source of both opportunity and conflict. Settlers poured across the Appalachians, clashing with native nations and raising questions about how new territories would be governed. The Articles had succeeded in preserving independence during the Revolution, but in peace, their flaws threatened the survival of the Union. Increasingly, leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison argued that a stronger national government was essential. The Revolution had won independence. Now the Republic needed a structure strong enough to endure it. By the mid-1780s, it was clear to many that reform was no longer optional. It was urgent. Economic instability, diplomatic weakness, and domestic unrest revealed the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation. A growing number of statesmen called for a convention to revise the framework of government. Hamilton and Madison were among the most vocal advocates, warning that without stronger unity, the Republic could fracture and fall prey to foreign powers. George Washington, who had retired to Mount Vernon after the war, initially hesitated to re-enter politics, weary from years of sacrifice. Yet as crises deepened, even he recognized the need for bold action. Small steps paved the way. In 1785, delegates from Maryland and Virginia met at Mount Vernon to resolve disputes over navigation rights on the Potomac River, a modest success that inspired broader cooperation. The following year, the Annapolis Convention convened to address interstate trade issues. Though only 5 states sent delegates, the meeting issued a powerful call for a full constitutional convention. That call was answered in 1787, when Congress authorized a gathering in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Yet many participants, including Madison and Hamilton, envisioned something far more ambitious, a complete overhaul of the system. What had begun as a revolution against distant monarchy was evolving into an experiment in self-government unprecedented in history. The Revolution's legacy was no longer just independence. It was the challenge of designing a republic that could embody the ideals of liberty, justice, and unity. As delegates prepared to meet in Philadelphia, the future of the American experiment hung in the balance. In the spring of 1787, delegates from across the United States gathered in Philadelphia to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The meeting, later known as the Constitutional Convention, was originally intended to revise the Articles, but from the start, it became clear that many leaders sought something far more ambitious: the creation of a new national government. 55 delegates attended, representing 12 states. Rhode Island, deeply distrustful of centralized power, refused to send any representatives. The gathering included some of the most remarkable figures of the era. George Washington, universally respected and chosen to preside over the convention. James Madison of Virginia, whose meticulous preparation and vision earned him the title Father of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton of New York, a passionate advocate for strong central authority, and Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman whose wit and wisdom helped bridge divides. The delegates met in secrecy, their windows shuttered and guards posted, to encourage open debate free from public pressure. From the very first sessions, it was evident that the Articles were beyond repair. The challenge, however, was immense. How to design a government strong enough to govern a vast and diverse republic, yet restrained enough to prevent tyranny? The revolution had been fought to escape the grasp of centralized power. Now its leaders grappled with creating a system that balanced liberty with order. as debates unfolded through the sweltering Philadelphia summer. Compromises would shape the future of the United States and determine whether the revolution's ideals could truly endure. The convention quickly revealed deep divisions among the delegates. Large states favored the Virginia Plan, proposed by Madison, which called for a strong national government with representation in Congress based on population. Smaller states, fearing domination, countered with the New Jersey Plan, which preserved equal representation regardless of size. The debate threatened to derail the proceedings until delegates forged the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives apportioned by population and a Senate granting equal representation to each state. Other contentious issues tested the fragile unity of the convention. Slavery, in particular, cast a long shadow. Southern states insisted on protections for the institution that underpinned their economies, while many Northern delegates condemned it as inconsistent with the Revolution's ideals. The result was a series of painful compromises, including the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. While these measures ensured unity, they also embedded contradictions that would haunt the nation for generations. The powers of the executive branch were another subject of fierce debate. Some feared a president would resemble a king. Others insisted strong leadership was essential. Ultimately, the office of the presidency was created with checks and balances. A 4-year term, command of the military, veto power, and election through the Electoral College rather than direct popular vote. The judiciary was also established to interpret laws and maintain balance. By weaving together compromises on representation, slavery, and executive authority, the delegates created a framework designed to hold a fragile union together. It was not perfect, but it was durable, a foundation for a republic unlike any the world had seen. By September 1787, after months of grueling debate, the delegates produced the final draft of the United States Constitution. It was a bold document, replacing the loose Confederation with a federal system that divided power between national and state governments. To take effect, however, the Constitution required ratification by 9 of the 13 states. This launched one of the most important political battles in American history: Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Federalists, including Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, argued passionately for ratification, emphasizing the need for unity, stability, and a government capable of protecting liberty. They wrote a series of essays, later known as the Federalist Papers, which laid out their vision and explained the Constitution's principles. Anti-Federalists, however, feared that the new government would become too powerful and trample on individual rights, echoing the very tyranny they had fought against during the Revolution. They demanded safeguards for personal freedoms. The debate was fierce, but gradually momentum built for ratification. In 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to approve, officially bringing the Constitution into effect. Yet concerns about individual liberties persisted, leading to the adoption of the Bill of Rights in 1791, 10 amendments guaranteeing freedoms such as speech, religion, and the press, as well as protections against government overreach. The ratification of the Constitution marked the culmination of the Revolution's political legacy, from rebellion against monarchy to the creation of a republic grounded in law, representation, and balance of power. It was an audacious experiment, one that sought to prove that liberty and order could coexist. The Revolution had secured independence. The Constitution secured the framework to preserve it for generations to come. When George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States in 1789, the world watched with cautious curiosity. The Revolution had produced independence, The Constitution had designed a government, but whether the system could actually function depended on Washington's leadership. His reputation as the hero of a revolution gave him unmatched authority, but the challenges before him were immense. The new federal government had no established traditions, no administrative machinery, and no guarantee of survival. Many feared that the fragile experiment might collapse into chaos or drift toward monarchy. Washington, aware of these dangers, carried himself with humility, insisting he was no king but a servant of the people. On April 30th, 1789, he took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the temporary capital. His inauguration was both solemn and hopeful, a symbol that the ideals fought for during the Revolution were now being put into practice. Yet the moment was also sobering. America faced staggering debt, uncertain foreign relations, and deep divisions between Federalists who favored strong national authority and Anti-Federalists who feared centralized power. Washington knew that every decision he made would set precedent for future presidents. He worked tirelessly to embody dignity, restraint, and unity. He established the first presidential cabinet, appointing Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. Their ideological clashes would shape the nation's future, but Washington's steady hand kept the government on course. His presidency marked the delicate transition from revolutionary ideals to the practical realities of governing. The Revolution had united Americans against a common enemy, but in independence, deep ideological divisions emerged. Central to these conflicts were the visions of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, both serving in Washington's cabinet. Hamilton believed in a strong national government and sought to stabilize the economy through bold measures. His financial program included assuming state debts, creating a national bank, and encouraging manufacturing through federal support. To Hamilton, economic strength was the foundation of national independence. Jefferson, however, envisioned a republic rooted in agrarian values, where power remained close to the people and states retained significant authority. He feared Hamilton's plans would create an elite aristocracy of bankers and speculators, betraying the Revolution's democratic ideals. Their rivalry gave rise to the first political factions, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Washington, though deeply troubled by the rise of partisan conflict, tried to maintain balance, urging cooperation. Yet the debates revealed how difficult it was to translate the Revolution's principles into governance. Should liberty be secured by dispersing power or by concentrating it in a strong national framework? Should America look to Britain as a model of commerce and order, or to France, then in the throes of its own revolution, as a symbol of Republican ideals? These questions divided leaders and citizens alike. Newspapers fueled the conflicts, turning policy debates into personal attacks. Though Washington stood above party, he could not prevent the emergence of political divisions that would shape American life. The Revolution had unleashed a thirst for liberty, but liberty carried within it the seeds of disagreement about its very meaning. After 2 terms in office, Washington made the unprecedented decision to step down voluntarily in 1797. His retirement was more than a personal choice. It was a statement of principle. By relinquishing power, Washington demonstrated that the presidency was not a lifetime office and that America would not descend into monarchy. His farewell address, delivered to the nation, was both a reflection on the Revolution's legacy and a warning for the future. He urged Americans to cherish national unity, warning against the dangers of sectionalism and factionalism. He cautioned against entangling alliances with foreign powers, believing that the young republic needed time to strengthen before being drawn into Europe's endless wars. Above all, he reminded citizens that the revolution's success depended not only on institutions, but on virtue, the moral character of the people themselves. Washington's departure set a precedent of peaceful transition of power, a cornerstone of American democracy. His leadership had bridged the gap between the Revolution and the Republic, proving that the ideals of independence could be sustained in practice. Yet challenges remained. The nation was still divided politically. Slavery persisted as a contradiction to the ideals of liberty, and tensions with Europe loomed. Still, Washington's presidency embodied the Revolution's enduring lesson that freedom required not only courage in war, but wisdom in peace. As he returned to Mount Vernon, the nation he helped to create moved forward into an uncertain but hopeful future, carrying with it the vision first declared in 1776, that liberty and self-government could thrive in a new world. The 1790s were marked by the echo of revolution abroad. In 1789, as Washington began his presidency, France erupted in revolution against its monarchy, inspired in part by America's own struggle for liberty. At first, Americans welcomed the French Revolution as a sister movement, another triumph of freedom against tyranny. Crowds celebrated in American cities, and Jeffersonian Republicans hailed France as a natural ally. Yet as the revolution radicalized, descending into violence and the reign of terror, divisions deepened. Should the United States support revolutionary France, honoring the alliance formed in 1778, or remain neutral to preserve stability? Washington, ever cautious, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, declaring that America would not take sides in the escalating war between Britain and France. This decision sparked fierce debate. Federalists supported neutrality, fearing that aligning with France would draw the young republic into devastating European wars. Jeffersonians, however, accused Washington of betraying revolutionary ideals and favoring Britain, the very empire America had just escaped. The arrival of French envoy Edmund Genet, who openly tried to rally American citizens to support France, only deepened tensions, forcing Washington to assert the nation's sovereignty. The dilemma revealed the revolution's enduring paradox. America had been born out of global conflict, yet as a fragile new nation, it could not afford reckless entanglements. Washington's neutrality set a precedent for cautious foreign policy, but it also highlighted the divisions within the Republic. The Revolution had declared universal ideals, yet applying those ideals in a turbulent world proved far more complicated than writing them on parchment. While foreign affairs tested America's diplomacy, domestic unrest tested the government's authority. In 1791, Congress imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits, part of Hamilton's plan to raise revenue and establish federal power over taxation. For many frontier farmers, especially in western Pennsylvania, whiskey was not merely a drink, but a form of currency and livelihood. To them, the tax was unfair and reminiscent of the oppressive levies they had resisted during the Revolution. Protests escalated into violence by 1794 as armed groups attacked tax collectors, burned property, and threatened federal authority. The crisis, known as the Whiskey Rebellion, posed a direct challenge to the new government. Would it respond with the weakness that had plagued the Articles of Confederation, or assert its authority decisively? Washington chose the latter. In an unprecedented move, he personally led a militia force of nearly 13,000 men into western Pennsylvania to quell the uprising. By the time they arrived, the rebels had dispersed, unwilling to face the might of the National Army. The rebellion collapsed without major bloodshed, but its significance was profound. The federal government had demonstrated its capacity to enforce laws and maintain order. Yet the episode also fueled political debate. Federalists hailed Washington's actions as proof that liberty required strong government. Jeffersonian Republicans, however, condemned it as an overreach, branding it a betrayal of the Revolution's spirit. The Whiskey Rebellion revealed the central question of the post-revolutionary era: how to balance liberty with authority. The Revolution had been fought against tyranny, but independence also demanded discipline and law to prevent anarchy. As Washington retired in 1797, the nation entered a new phase under its second president, John Adams. His presidency was dominated by international crisis and deepening partisan conflict. France, angered by America's neutrality and its trade with Britain, began seizing American ships. When American envoys went to negotiate in Paris, they were met with demands for bribes in the infamous XYZ affair, which outraged the public and sparked calls for war. Though a full war was avoided, America entered a quasi-war with France, an undeclared naval conflict fought in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic. The crisis deepened partisan divisions at home. Federalists, led by Adams and Hamilton, pushed for military buildup and closer ties with Britain, while Jeffersonian Republicans accused them of betraying the Revolution's principles. The atmosphere grew so heated that the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which restricted criticism of the government and targeted immigrants suspected of sympathizing with France. To Republicans, these laws were proof of tyranny, a direct violation of the freedoms promised in the Bill of Rights. Jefferson and Madison responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, asserting that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The nation seemed on the brink of internal fracture. Yet Adams, defying his own party's hawks, pursued peace with France, eventually securing a settlement. His decision cost him politically, but preserved the young republic from a potentially ruinous war. The 1790s revealed that the Revolution's legacy was fragile, contested, and constantly under pressure. Independence had been won, but defining what liberty meant and how to preserve it in practice remained an unfinished struggle. The Revolution had proven that liberty could be won on the battlefield, but the true test came in 1800. Could power be transferred peacefully between rival factions? The presidential election of that year pitted incumbent John Adams, the Federalist, against his old ally turned rival Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic Republicans. The campaign was fierce, bitter, and deeply personal. Federalists warned that Jefferson was a dangerous radical who would unleash mob rule, pointing to the chaos of the French Revolution as a warning. Republicans accused Adams of monarchist tendencies, portraying him as a tyrant bent on crushing liberty. Newspapers on both sides hurled insults, and the young republic trembled on the edge of crisis. The outcome was so close that it led to an electoral deadlock between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his running mate, under the original rules of the Constitution. The tie threw the election into the House of Representatives, where Federalists debated whether to block Jefferson's victory. The nation held its breath. Would America descend into violence? Would the Revolution's promise collapse into partisan tyranny? At last, after weeks of tension, Alexander Hamilton, despite his opposition to Jefferson, intervened, urging Federalists to support Jefferson over Burr, whom he distrusted as dangerously ambitious. Jefferson prevailed, and in March 1801, he was inaugurated as the third president of the United States. The peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, accomplished without violence, was unprecedented in history. Jefferson himself called it the Revolution of 1800, not a revolution of muskets and blood, but of ballots and principles. It demonstrated that the ideals of 1776 could be sustained not only in war, but in democracy. As president, Jefferson sought to put into practice his vision of America as a republic rooted in liberty, equality, and agrarian simplicity. He cut government expenses, reduced the size of the military, and sought to dismantle much of Hamilton's financial system. To Jefferson, the yeoman farmer embodied the purest form of Republican virtue, independent, self-reliant, and free from the corrupting influence of big cities and commerce. He believed America's destiny lay not in becoming a manufacturing giant, but in spreading across fertile lands, where citizens could own property and govern themselves. His administration also marked a symbolic shift. Jefferson walked to his inauguration instead of riding in a carriage, dressed plainly rather than in aristocratic splendor, signaling humility and a rejection of monarchy-like ceremony. Yet Jefferson's vision was not without contradictions. Though he preached equality, he was a slaveholder whose plantations depended on enslaved labor. He spoke of liberty, but presided over a society that excluded women, African Americans, and Native Americans from its promises. Still, his presidency brought significant achievements. In 1803, Jefferson seized an extraordinary opportunity with the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the United States and securing vast western lands for future generations. Though criticized for stretching constitutional authority, Jefferson justified it as an act of national necessity. The purchase symbolized America's expansionist spirit and reinforced Jefferson's dream of a continental republic of farmers. His administration showed both the promise and the paradoxes of the Revolution's ideals. Liberty extended for some, denied for others, yet always evolving in scope. Despite Jefferson's vision of simplicity and peace, his presidency was not free of conflict. Abroad, America found itself entangled in disputes with European powers. The Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe, and both Britain and France interfered with American trade. British ships, in particular, impressed American sailors into service, igniting outrage and testing Jefferson's policy of avoiding war. In response, Jefferson imposed the Embargo Act of 1807, halting American exports in an attempt to pressure Britain and France. Instead, the embargo devastated American merchants and farmers, plunging the economy into crisis. At home, Jefferson also faced challenges to the balance of power between branches of government. The landmark case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803 established the principle of judicial review, strengthening the judiciary's role in interpreting the Constitution. This decision, though not of Jefferson's making, ensured that the Revolution's ideals would be mediated through law as much as politics. Jefferson also struggled with the contradictions of slavery and Native American policy. His expansionist vision pushed indigenous peoples further from their lands, and his own reliance on enslaved labor exposed the deep moral divide within the Republic. Yet through triumphs and trials, Jefferson's presidency preserved the Republic and deepened its democratic character. The Revolution of 1776 had created independence. The Revolution of 1800 ensured that independence could endure through peaceful political change. The experiment in self-government survived another great test, proving that liberty was not a fleeting dream, but a living principle, capable of guiding a nation through both prosperity and peril. Though the Treaty of Paris had ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, tensions between the United States and Britain never fully disappeared. By the early 19th century, a new generation of Americans believed the Revolution's promises had not yet been fully secured. The roots of the War of 1812 lay in unresolved grievances. Chief among them was Britain's policy of impressment. the forced conscription of American sailors into the Royal Navy. Britain, locked in a desperate struggle against Napoleon in Europe, claimed the right to stop American ships and sea sailors, arguing that many were British deserters. To Americans, however, it was an intolerable violation of sovereignty and dignity. Equally infuriating was Britain's interference with American trade. Through a series of orders in council, Britain restricted neutral commerce with France, crippling American merchants. Beyond the seas, tensions flared on the frontier. Britain maintained forts in the Northwest Territory, supporting Native American resistance to American expansion. Leaders like Tecumseh, the Shawnee Chief, forged confederacies to resist land encroachment, often supplied with British weapons. Many Americans, particularly young politicians known as the war hawks from the South and West, demanded action. Figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun argued that only war could defend national honor, secure maritime rights, and expand American territory, perhaps even into Canada. President James Madison, cautious by nature, was reluctant to plunge into conflict, but mounting pressure left him little choice. In June 1812, Congress declared war on Britain, the first time the United States formally declared war. For supporters, it was the final stage of the Revolution, a chance to prove that America was truly independent and would no longer submit to foreign domination. The declaration of war was bold, but the United States entered the conflict poorly prepared. The regular army was small, disorganized, and led by aging Revolutionary War veterans. The Navy, though spirited, was dwarfed by Britain's mighty fleet. Initial American invasions of Canada ended in disaster. At Detroit, General William Hull surrendered without a fight, and other campaigns faltered in confusion. On the seas, however, Americans won surprising victories. Small but nimble frigates like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, and the USS United States defeated British warships in celebrated duels, boosting morale and proving that American seamanship was formidable. Still, the British blockade tightened around American ports, strangling trade and impoverishing coastal communities. On the frontier, fighting was fierce and brutal. Native confederacies allied with the British struck at American settlements, while American militias retaliated with equal ferocity. The war was divisive at home. New England Federalists bitterly opposed it, seeing it as reckless and ruinous to commerce, while Republicans in the South and West framed it as a fight for honor and expansion. The war also deepened partisan divides and raised doubts about national unity. Yet amidst setbacks, moments of heroism kept the cause alive. In 1813, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry won a decisive naval victory on Lake Erie, famously reporting, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." This triumph forced the British to retreat and opened the way for American victories on land, including the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed, shattering native resistance in the Northwest. Though progress was uneven, the war became a crucible in which the young republic tested its will to survive against the empire it had defied in the Revolution. By 1814, the war reached a dramatic climax. With Napoleon temporarily defeated in Europe, Britain could redirect more troops and ships to America. British forces launched offensives along the coast, invading the Chesapeake Bay region. In August 1814, they marched into Washington, D.C., and burned the Capitol, the White House, and other public buildings. The humiliation shocked Americans, yet it also stirred renewed determination. In Baltimore a month later, the city's defenders held firm against British bombardment at Fort McHenry. As rockets and shells lit up the night sky, Francis Scott Key, witnessing the battle, penned the words that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner, immortalizing American resilience. Meanwhile, in the South, General Andrew Jackson emerged as a national hero. At the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, his motley force of regulars, militia, free black soldiers, and even pirates decisively crushed a larger British army. Ironically, the battle occurred after peace had already been negotiated. In December 1814, American and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war. The treaty restored pre-war boundaries, but said nothing about impressment or trade restrictions, the very issues that had sparked the conflict. Yet Americans celebrated it as a victory. The mere fact that the United States had fought the British Empire to a draw solidified its independence in the eyes of the world. The war fostered a new sense of national pride, often called the era of good feelings, and confirmed that the Revolution's promise of sovereignty was real. The Second War of Independence had not conquered territory, but it had conquered doubt. America was here to stay, a nation that could defend itself and define its own destiny. After the War of 1812, Americans turned their gaze westward with renewed confidence. The Revolution had secured independence, and the Treaty of Ghent confirmed sovereignty, but the true test of the young republic's destiny lay in the vast lands stretching beyond the Appalachians. Settlement of the frontier was not a new phenomenon. Pioneers had been crossing into Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley even before independence. But in the post-war years, expansion accelerated at a staggering pace. The federal government, eager to transform the wilderness into productive farmland and strengthen the Union, passed measures like the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which outlined how new territories could become states. Unlike the old empires of Europe, America promised that new states would enter the Union as equals, not colonies. This principle reflected the Revolution's rejection of distant domination, but expansion carried contradictions. For white settlers, the frontier symbolized opportunity, independence, and the fulfillment of Jefferson's dream of a republic of farmers. For Native Americans, however, it meant dispossession, broken treaties, and relentless pressure to abandon their homelands. The Revolution had proclaimed the right to liberty and self-determination, but in practice, those ideals often excluded indigenous peoples. Westward migration was fueled by both hope and hardship. Families packed wagons, braved rugged trails, and carved farms from forests, often enduring isolation and danger. Yet the lure of fertile land and the promise of self-sufficiency drew thousands onward. Expansion was seen not only as a right, but as a destiny, a belief that the Revolution's legacy was to spread freedom across the continent. This vision, later known as Manifest Destiny, was already taking shape in the early decades of the Republic, shaping America's identity and future conflicts. For Native American nations, the Revolution was not a triumph, but a catastrophe. Many tribes had allied with Britain during the war, hoping to halt colonial encroachment, and with Britain's defeat, they faced relentless American expansion without powerful allies. In the Northwest Territory, leaders like Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, sought to unite tribes into a confederacy to resist the tide of settlement. Tecumseh's vision was remarkable, a united native front that transcended tribal divisions, asserting that the land was not to be sold or ceded piecemeal, but held in common for all indigenous peoples. His movement gained strength in the early 1800s, but was dealt a devastating blow at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 and with Tecumseh's death in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames. After his fall, organized resistance in the Northwest waned, and American settlers surged forward. In the Southeast, powerful nations like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole faced similar pressures. Some sought accommodation, adopting aspects of European American culture to maintain sovereignty, while others resisted militarily. The Revolution's ideals of liberty and equality rang hollow as treaties were signed under duress. Promises were broken and lands were seized. The irony was stark. A nation founded on the principle of self-determination denied it to the first peoples of the land. Expansion brought prosperity to settlers, but devastation to native communities, a contradiction that lay at the heart of the Revolution's legacy. Liberty was proclaimed as universal, yet in practice, it was often selective, an unfinished promise that would haunt America's conscience for centuries. As settlers spread westward, another contradiction of the Revolution grew more glaring: the persistence of slavery. The Revolution had sparked debates about freedom and human rights, inspiring some northern states to gradually abolish slavery. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in new territories north of the Ohio River, creating a dividing line between free and slave states. Yet in the South, slavery expanded alongside cotton cultivation, driven by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Westward expansion thus carried with it not only settlers seeking land, but also enslaved people forced into new frontiers. Every new territory raised the question: would it permit slavery or prohibit it? This tension threatened to fracture the fragile Union. The Revolution's ideals of equality clashed with the economic realities of bondage. Leaders like Jefferson, himself a slaveholder, acknowledged the moral crisis but failed to resolve it, famously writing that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to maintain balance, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state while prohibiting slavery north of a certain latitude. It was a temporary solution to a problem that ran deep into the nation's foundations. Expansion exposed the Revolution's unfinished business. Could a republic founded on liberty endure while denying it to millions? On the frontier, settlers spoke of freedom and opportunity, yet their advance depended on the displacement of native peoples, and in the South, the expansion of human bondage. The Revolution had created a new nation, but its legacy was tangled with contradictions that would shape the struggles of the 19th century. After the War of 1812, the United States entered a period often described as the era of good feelings. Though the phrase, coined by a newspaper during President James Monroe's 1817 tour of the nation, was partly optimistic propaganda, it reflected genuine trends. For the first time since independence, America experienced a sense of unity, pride, and confidence. The Revolution had secured freedom, and the War of 1812 had confirmed independence against Britain. Now, Americans looked inward, eager to build a strong republic. Politically, the Federalist Party collapsed after opposing the war, leaving the Democratic Republicans dominant. Without intense partisan rivalry, national politics seemed calmer, though divisions simmered beneath the surface. Economically, the post-war years saw the rise of American industry, banking, and transportation improvements. Canals, roads, and later railroads began to knit the vast nation together. The Revolution's ideals of liberty and self-determination were now coupled with an emerging belief in progress and destiny. Culturally, Americans developed a stronger sense of identity, celebrating revolutionary heroes and framing the nation's history as a triumph of virtue and resilience. Yet the good feelings masked tensions. Regional differences persisted between North and South, East and West, free and slave states. The Revolution had forged unity, but unity was fragile, dependent on compromises and a willingness to hold together despite differences. Still, for a generation that had endured war, foreign threats, and political turmoil, the 1810s and 1820s felt like a moment of possibility. The Revolution's promise was no longer only survival. It was prosperity, expansion, and the conviction that the United States had a unique role to play in the world. The spirit of nationalism during Monroe's presidency found powerful expression in foreign policy. In 1823, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and President Monroe issued what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. It declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization, and that any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of the Americas would be seen as a threat to the United States. In return, the United States pledged to stay out of European wars and politics. Though the doctrine had little immediate enforcement power, the U.S. Navy was too small to deter great powers. It symbolized a bold claim to hemispheric leadership. It reflected the Revolution's legacy of independence, now extended beyond national borders into a vision of continental sovereignty. The Monroe Doctrine was also influenced by global events. Latin American nations were winning independence from Spain, and the United States, itself born from revolution, sympathized with their struggles. At the same time, Americans saw opportunities for trade and influence in a hemisphere free from Old World empires. Nationalism was also visible domestically. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, issued rulings that strengthened federal authority, such as McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, which upheld the constitutionality of the National Bank, and Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, which reinforced federal power over interstate commerce. These decisions reflected the Revolution's unresolved question: how to balance liberty with national unity. The Monroe Doctrine and Marshall Court both asserted that America was not just a collection of states, but a single sovereign nation. It was a declaration that the Revolution's ideals were maturing into a powerful national identity. Despite the optimism of the era of good feelings, deep tensions simmered, revealing that the Revolution's ideals remained contested. Chief among them was the question of slavery. The rapid expansion of cotton agriculture and westward migration brought the issue to the forefront with the Missouri Crisis of 1819 to 1820. When Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, Northern politicians resisted, fearing the balance of power in Congress would tip toward the South. The crisis threatened to tear apart the Union, exposing the fragility of national unity. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily defused the conflict. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and slavery was prohibited in territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line. The compromise preserved peace, but it was a bandage over a deep wound. The Revolution's promise of liberty remained selective, and the contradiction of a republic founded on freedom, yet dependent on slavery, grew sharper. Economic divides also widened. The industrial North, agricultural South, and frontier West developed distinct interests, fueling regional rivalries. Even within the Democratic-Republican Party, factions emerged, foreshadowing the return of partisan politics. For ordinary citizens, the Revolution's legacy meant different things. To farmers, it promised land and independence. To entrepreneurs, it meant opportunity in trade and industry. To enslaved people, it remained a dream deferred. To Native Americans, it meant displacement. The era of good feelings revealed both the endurance and the limits of revolutionary ideals. America was no longer a fragile experiment, but its future depended on whether it could reconcile liberty with unity, progress with justice. The Revolution story was not over. It was evolving, carried forward by new generations facing new tests. By the 1820s and 1830s, a new political era dawned in the United States, often called the Age of Jackson after its dominant figure, Andrew Jackson. A hero of the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson embodied a rugged frontier spirit and appealed to the common man in a way no previous president had. His rise marked a profound shift in American politics. Whereas the Revolution had been led largely by elites, landowners, lawyers, and intellectuals, the Jacksonian era expanded participation to broader segments of white men. Property qualifications for voting were steadily eliminated, and turnout in elections surged. Jackson's supporters framed his victory in 1828 as a triumph of popular democracy, portraying him as a champion of the people against entrenched elites. To many Americans, this seemed the natural fulfillment of the Revolution's ideals: government by the people, not just the privileged few. Jackson himself cultivated the image of a man of the people, rough-edged, self-made, and fiercely independent. Yet his democracy was deeply exclusive. Women, African Americans, and Native Americans were excluded from the political community, and the expansion of rights for white men coincided with harsher oppression for others. Jackson's presidency revealed both the power and the limits of the Revolution's promise. It showed that the ideals of liberty and equality could inspire broader participation, but also that America's definition of the people remained narrow and contested. The Revolution's legacy was alive, but it was being reinterpreted through the lens of mass politics, populism, and a vision of democracy that was at once empowering and divisive. While Jackson's presidency expanded democracy for white men, it inflicted devastating consequences on Native American nations. The Revolution had unleashed waves of settlement across the continent, and by the 1830s, pressure for land reached a crisis point. Jackson, committed to expansion and convinced that coexistence was impossible, championed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties forcing native tribes to cede their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for territory in the West. Despite legal victories such as Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, in which the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty, Jackson refused to enforce the decision, allegedly declaring, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The result was a tragic chapter in American history. The forced removal of tens of thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands perished from disease, exposure, and starvation along the brutal march. This policy starkly revealed the contradictions of the Revolution's legacy. The United States, founded on the principle of self-determination, denied it to the first peoples of the land. Expansion, celebrated as liberty for settlers, was destruction for native communities. For Jackson and his supporters, removal was framed as necessary for national progress, but for the tribes, it was a catastrophe that shattered lives and cultures. The Revolution had promised liberty, but in practice, it often meant liberty for some built on the dispossession of others. The Trail of Tears remains one of the most haunting reminders of the gap between the Revolution's ideals and America's realities. The Jacksonian era also exposed deepening rifts within the Union. One of the most serious crises came during the nullification controversy of the early 1830s. Southern states, particularly South Carolina, protested federal tariffs they believed unfairly favored northern industry at the expense of southern agriculture. Led by John C. Calhoun, South Carolina declared that states had the right to nullify federal laws deemed unconstitutional. Jackson, though a Southerner himself, fiercely opposed this challenge to federal authority. He saw nullification as a direct threat to the Union, the very unity secured by the Revolution. In a dramatic stand, Jackson issued a proclamation defending the supremacy of the federal government and threatened to use force if necessary. The crisis was eventually defused through compromise, but it foreshadowed the sectional conflicts that would later erupt into civil war. At the same time, slavery remained the nation's deepest contradiction. As cotton expanded, the South became ever more dependent on enslaved labor, while abolitionist movements grew in the North, invoking the Revolution's ideals of liberty and equality. Jackson himself was a slaveholder, reflecting the persistence of the institution at the heart of American society. The Revolution had proclaimed that all men are created equal, but by the 1830s, it was increasingly clear that the Republic had not resolved who truly belonged within that promise. The Jacksonian era, with its populism, expansion, and fierce struggles over authority, revealed that the Revolution's legacy was not fixed. It was a contested inheritance, redefined with each generation, carrying both the inspiration of liberty and the shadow of exclusion. By the mid-19th century, nearly 3 generations had passed since muskets fired at Lexington and Concord, yet the memory of the American Revolution continued to shape the nation's identity. Veterans of the Continental Army, now old men, were celebrated as living links to the founding struggle. Towns preserved battlefields as sacred ground. Families told stories of sacrifices endured, and the 4th of July became a civic ritual uniting communities in parades, speeches, and fireworks. For Americans, the Revolution was not just history. It was mythology, a source of pride and legitimacy for the Republic. Leaders invoked it constantly, from debates over tariffs to arguments about slavery, claiming to embody the founders' true intentions. Abroad, the Revolution inspired movements across Europe and Latin America. Leaders like Simón Bolívar looked to the United States as proof that colonies could overthrow empires and govern themselves. At the same time, critics pointed out the contradictions between the Revolution's ideals and America's realities. Enslavement, dispossession of native peoples, and restrictions on women's rights. Even within the United States, different groups remembered the Revolution in different ways. For some, it was a story of liberty secured through arms. For others, it was a promise still unfulfilled. Memory of the Revolution became both unifying and divisive, a shared heritage, but also a contested one. It remained a living symbol, constantly reinterpreted as each generation sought to define what freedom and independence truly meant. The Revolution was not just an event frozen in the past. It was a legacy shaping the present and the future of the Republic. Despite independence and the creation of a functioning republic, the Revolution left profound contradictions unresolved. Slavery, above all, stood as the greatest betrayal of its ideals. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet millions remained in bondage. Abolitionists in the North invoked revolutionary language to demand emancipation, while enslaved people themselves seized on its promises to resist, escape, or dream of freedom. Native Americans, who had been dispossessed during and after the Revolution, continued to face removal, broken treaties, and violence as settlers pressed westward. For women, the Revolution raised hopes but delivered limited change. Figures like Abigail Adams, who had urged her husband to remember the ladies, symbolized aspirations for greater rights. Yet the new republic largely excluded women from political life. The Revolution's legacy was therefore paradoxical. It created a nation founded on liberty, but it left many outside its circle of belonging. In this sense, the Revolution was unfinished. Its ideals became a yardstick by which later generations would measure progress and demand change. From abolitionists to suffragists, from civil rights activists to labor reformers, Americans repeatedly returned to the words of 1776 as a promise still waiting to be fully realized. This capacity for reinvention, of using the revolution as both inspiration and critique, became central to the nation's character. The revolution was not a completed story, but a continuing struggle, its ideals echoing in the movements that sought to make America live up to its founding creed. The American Revolution was more than a war of muskets and declarations. It was a transformation in the very idea of government. It introduced the radical notion that sovereignty resided not in kings or parliaments, but in the people themselves. It proved that colonies could overthrow an empire and create a republic grounded in law and representation. Its impact extended far beyond America's borders, shaping revolutions and reform movements worldwide. Yet its most enduring meaning lay within the United States, where its ideals became a compass guiding the nation through triumphs and trials. Every generation returned to the revolution to ask anew, what does freedom mean and who is entitled to it? The revolution did not answer these questions once and for all. It set them in motion. Its legacy is a tension between aspiration and reality, principle and practice. For some, it was a victory of farmers and artisans over monarchy. For others, it was the foundation of a continental empire. For still others, it was a call to extend liberty to those excluded at the founding. As America expanded, divided, and redefined itself, the revolution remained the touchstone of its identity. Even today, the revolution speaks not only of the past, but of the future, a reminder that liberty is never finished, independence must be defended, and democracy is always a work in progress. In this way, the revolution endures, not just as a historical event, but as a living challenge, calling each generation to preserve, expand, and fulfill the promise first declared on a July day in 1776. You've just traveled across 2 centuries of struggle, hope, and transformation, the full story of the American Revolution. We saw how protests in Boston lit the first sparks of defiance, how Washington's leadership and the courage of common soldiers kept the dream alive, and how alliances and endurance turned defeat into victory at Yorktown. We explore the revolution's aftermath, the Constitution, the rise of democracy, expansion, contradictions, and how its promises of liberty remained both powerful and unfinished. The moral of this story is clear. Freedom is never won once and for all. It must be protected, expanded, and redefined by every generation. The revolution reminds us that liberty is not just a gift, but a responsibility. Thank you for joining me today on History Teller YT. If you found inspiration in this journey, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because there are many more stories of history waiting to be told right here. Together, we'll continue to explore the triumphs, struggles, and legacies that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, the past is not dead. It lives within us, guiding the future. See you again soon, only on History Teller YT.